With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And good evening, everybody. Happy Monday to all of you. We are back for the week, and whether you are joining us on Facebook Live, on YouTube, on Periscope, on Twitch, or Twitter, however you're watching us, we certainly do appreciate you making us a part of your busy day right here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for joining me here on this program, and I just wanted to let you know right out of the gate, I probably won't be able to go as long as I normally do tonight just because, well, for one, we're getting started a little late, and also because the reason that we're doing so is because I've been feeling a little bit under the weather. I'll do my best to soldier through, but if for whatever reason I just kind of have to cut the show short, you know why. And the thing is, normally, because I'm not feeling real sick, I would just power through it. But I do have to go to Ukraine in just a few days, and I'm really going to need my voice while I'm over there. I'm going to be of very little use to anyone if I go over there, but my voice isn't working. So I kind of have to protect my voice on that, and because of that, if my voice starts feeling really strained, then I will probably just have to gracefully bow out, because I really hope I'm not getting sick. I think it's not that. I think what actually is going on is I just went a little too hard in chapel this morning and sung a little too hard, and my throat's been feeling a little strained ever since, so just didn't want y'all to freak out. I'm fine. I have to protect my voice, and that may be why I have to cut this show a little bit short. But we have a lot to talk about, so I hope that I can get everything in. And the vast majority of our news today, as usual, is local news. The big story coming up today that broke just today is that Senator Cam Ward, and for those of us, especially around the Chilton County area, up in Clanton, that kind of, not quite the river region, but basically the bigger region north of the river region. If you're up there in Peach Country, you probably are quite familiar with Senator Cam Ward. That's the district that he represents, and he is going to be looking for the first position on the Supreme Court. And I know it's a little weird. We're one of only, I believe, 2 states that actually elects our Supreme Court justices. It may be more than that, but last I heard, I believe it actually is just us and one other state. So that's something that we do that's kind of unique. And Senator Cam Ward is going to be trying to get a seat on the bench. Now, to my knowledge, Senator Ward has never actually been a judge. He's an attorney. He has a law degree. Do know that much. But I don't know that he's ever actually judged, and so I do think it's a little bit of a weird step for him to go from, and by the way, if I'm wrong on that, somebody correct me, at Tactics Radio. That would be the way to do that. If you want to get in touch with me, you can always email me, tacticsradio@gmail.com. If I'm wrong about that, somebody out there, maybe one of my lawyer buddies, can fact check me on that if you need to, and I certainly appreciate the help. But to my knowledge, Senator Ward has never been a judge. And I do think it's a really odd step when people seek the Supreme Court judge seat if they've never actually been a judge in a lower court. It's legal. They're technically allowed to do it. You don't even have to have a law degree. But I do think it's pretty strange that they would do this, and that he would seek that judgeship despite not actually having been a judge before. This was what Senator Ward said in response to him saying that he's going to be running for this position. The roles of the 3 branches of government are very well defined. The legislative branch writes the laws, the executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. My judicial philosophy will be easy to understand. As a judge, my role will be to interpret the law exactly as it is written, not to write new ones. Okay, well, he talks a good game at least. And I genuinely hope that what he's saying there is 100% sincere. Again, it's hard to gauge this because he's not been a judge, at least not that I'm aware of. And so, because of that, it's really hard to tell whether this is just, you know, paying lip service to textualism or he actually is a textualist. I don't know. I don't have any way to check that against anything, which is the reason that I think people need to have been judges and have a clear record of a judicial philosophy before they run for a Supreme Court position. That's just my opinion, but I think that there's good reason for desiring that, because if what he's saying right there is what he really believes, then I wouldn't have a problem with Senator Ward sitting on the bench. But the problem is I have no record to check against that. So he could be sincere, or he could just be paying lip service to it, or what he means by when he says he's going to interpret the law, he says interpret it the way that I want it to. Doesn't seem like that's what he would do based on this quote, but you don't know. Because the truth is, a lot of very liberal justices would say the same thing and do the exact opposite. I don't think that Cam Ward's going to be Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but you understand what I'm saying. It's difficult to take someone on their word what their judicial philosophy will be when they haven't actually sat in that role before. But if Senator Ward does that, then I'd be fine with having Senator Ward as a Supreme Court justice. The only thing that we really can check him against is his record in the Senate, which has not been great. It's not bad, and I would even argue that it is better than average. When I look at Senator Ward, to put it into terms of a national Senate race, I think of Ward as being very similar to Marco Rubio in a lot of ways. He's not unconservative, but he's definitely not one of the more conservative ones. Because most of the time, Marco Rubio votes for things that we would want. You know, less regulation, less taxes, and every once in a while, Marco decides, you know what, I'm just going to go with the Gang of Eight immigration plan that gives de facto amnesty to millions of illegal immigrants. You know, it's not like Rubio's a liberal all the time, or that, I mean, he certainly no Lisa Murkowski or John McCain that about half the time, even more than half the time, sometimes votes with the Democrats. But he's also not like a Mike Lee or a Ted Cruz. He's definitely not in that upper echelon of conservatism that pretty much always votes the way that he should. And so he's not middle tier exactly, because so many of the senators up there are less conservative than Marco Rubio, if you're looking at their voting record. That's kind of how Senator Ward is. He's not unconservative. He's just not one of the better conservative senators. That would be how I would classify him. Perfect example of this, he tends to be very socially conservative, which is good. It's a feather in his cap. I'm glad that he's socially conservative. And if you're sitting on the bench, socially conservative is certainly a good thing to have. But let's also remember that even most of the Democrats are socially conservative in Alabama. They have to be. If you're looking at a Democrat from Alabama, now I'm not talking about Doug Jones, he's a very notable exception. But if you're looking at some of the Democrats in the state of Alabama, you will find that they are more socially conservative than some of the Republicans in other states. It's because Alabama is such a conservative state with very socially conservative values. For example, there are members of the Democrat Party here in the state of Alabama, whether you're talking about peons or even, I would say, mid to upper level guys that aren't necessarily on board with everything in the Democrat agenda. There are some pro-life Democrats. There are some anti-gay marriage Democrats that live here in the state. I don't know that I would say that they're the majority anymore, because everything's become so nationalized. But you understand what my point is. Even though I think that it is a feather in his cap that Cam Ward is a social conservative, let's not pretend like those aren't a dime a dozen in the state of Alabama. Like I said, even the Democrats tend to be more socially conservative than some Republicans in other states. If you were to, this is just my guess, I don't have anything to back this up. This is going into Caleb's opinion here, so I want to give you fair warning. If we were to look into it, I would speculate that Alabama's Democrats would be more socially conservative than Oregon or Washington's Republicans. Could be wrong, but I would guess that there's at least substantial data to back this up if you were to actually poll it and study it. But you understand my point in all of that. A good example of why Senator Ward is socially conservative but not really actually conservative in a lot of ways is because he seems to really like spending and taxes. A good example of this is he's one of the ones that voted for the gas tax. And by the way, my own senator, Senator Chambliss, also did, and I'm still steamed at him for that too. But the point is, he is not somebody that stood his ground. He is not somebody that decided that it was worth his time and risking his political career to do what the people of Alabama wanted. He decided that it was best to go with the flow, go with the establishment, and get a little extra money to play around in the state Senate. And so that's what he did. He voted to tax you and increase your gas taxes in perpetuity forever if the bill calls for it. Basically put it on autopilot that thing is going to go up 2 cents every year. But yeah, he's a real conservative. No, not after you vote for that. And when another one that would be a good point to bring up is he voted for exempting, quote, economic developers from lobbyist status. You remember that we had a big fight about this, and this is one of the things that we talked about on the air about a year ago, is that the Senate wound up passing a bill that allowed for economic developers to be classified as non-lobbyists, so they're not subject to any of their rules. And I don't want to rehash the whole debate, but when you're looking at the primary thing the Republicans did when they took office after having been under Democrat control for, I think, 138 years, the first thing that they did is start ethics reform. And not long after that, the Republicans started doing a whole lot of the same things the Democrats were doing, but nonetheless, they started with ethics reform, and in a lot of ways, this bill really neutered that. Basically saying, well, all you have to do is call yourself an economic developer, and then you really don't have to even worry about the lobbyist title. Granted, there were some amendments that made it a little less broad so that more people would qualify as lobbyists. But the point is, they absolutely gutted the core of the Alabama ethics reform. So Cam Ward, like I said, he's not a flaming left close liberal or anything like that. I don't think that he would be a Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the court. But if we're putting it in terms of liberal versus conservative, he's probably not the most conservative choice we would make. I don't think we're going to see a Tom Parker out of him, for example. Maybe I'm wrong, but I really don't think so. So that's just kind of my takeaway on that. And as far as the transition from a lawmaker to a actual interpreter of the law, a member of the judiciary, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. We've seen this play out on the national stage. We've seen it play out on Alabama's stage. In my experience, and there are exceptions to this, what typically happens is once they get onto the court, it just magnifies what they already were. They don't change while they go onto the court. They're kind of the way that they are, and then that just sort of gets blown up or emphasized once they're on the court because they're in a more powerful position where they're making more specific decisions. And this is really where the problem lies with Cam Ward, because if we're looking at his voting record and we're looking at some of his beliefs, I'm not saying that a person has to be perfectly in line with me politically to run for this office. That would be absurd. But there are some really big red flags that Cam Ward wouldn't be as conservative as we might think. I think he's going to be good on the social issues. I don't know that he necessarily would on the economic issues. And that's why I'm in no way ruling out voting for Senator Ward, but I would have to do some serious consideration. When it comes to Senator Ward, I don't think that it would be... I don't think that you could get to a point with the knowledge that we have right now saying, nope, doesn't matter who's running against Senator Ward, I would vote for the other person. I don't think that that would be fair. I don't think that that would be right. And frankly, I just don't think that it's a correct way to view any election. But I'm not ruling out Senator Cam Ward. I'm not saying that I'll vote for just about anybody that's running against him. But I do really wish that we had a more conservative option, and maybe in the next few weeks we will. Maybe somebody else will throw their hat into that race. One thing that I wanted to mention as well, a little bit of local news to just sort of clarify a story that I gave out yesterday, because whenever I give out misinformation, whenever I mistakenly give out bad information, I always want to correct it. So I talked to a reliable source who happens to know the manager of the Chick-fil-A in East El Mall. You may remember about 2 or 3 days ago. Well, it would have been longer than that because of the weekend, but anyway, just recently, last week, on a segment, we talked about the Chick-fil-A closing. And closing on October the 31st, which I said at the time was really suspicious because it's a company that is known for their Christian values, their Christian heritage. I mean, they're not even open on Sundays. All of a sudden closing down on Halloween. And immediately when I heard that, I thought, well, who could be behind this? Could it be Satan? But, and yes, I'm using that joke over again because I like it that much. But anyway, it turns out that's actually not what's happening. Even though I did get that original story from a reliable source, apparently there was some bad information going around, and it turns out that store is actually going to be closing on the 19th. And it turns out they are not closing down because of problems with bringing in money. Evidently, even though I stand by the other things I said about East El Mall, where about half the stores are empty. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that that mall may be dying soon, and I don't want them to, but I think that that's probably the way that it's going. It feels very similar to what happened in Montgomery Mall in the years before it collapsed. But with the Chick-fil-A, apparently it's not a money issue. Chick-fil-A is just starting to try to slowly wean itself off of mall stores. They're wanting to go to standalone stores only, which I find very surprising considering that Chick-fil-A actually started in an Atlanta mall. The first store was a mall location. And so I do find it a little odd that they've decided to go to freestanding only and are trying to get out of that food court mall market. But apparently that's what's happening. And the owner, he does own another store. That part of the story was true. But it's monetarily better for him because of the way that they scale the amount of money that they're getting. And he'll be making more in the new location, even though the store that's in the mall location right now is $1 million store. It turns about $1 million every year. And so, I mean, it sounds to me that a lot of the information that out there was wrong. And so I just wanted to correct the record. Closing on the 19th, not closing because of monetary issues. It's actually closing because the manager it's going to be better for him personally. So that's just sort of to correct the record. And then another big local story, which is really fascinating on a number of levels because you're not really sure where to take it. It's one of those odd stories. A great way to characterize this, if you're familiar with the Masterpiece Cake Shop case in the Supreme Court, you remember how they technically gave the win to Masterpiece Cake Shop, but they essentially did it on the most narrow ground possible, to where they almost acted like they weren't going to give it to Masterpiece Cake Shop and wanted to really walk that tightrope of not giving it to him, and gave him the most narrow ground possible to do that. That's kind of what this statement is like. This next story is about Tommy Tuberville and him actually criticizing Trump, but he does so in such a way that he's trying to sort of hide the fact that he's criticizing Trump, or at least criticizing one of Trump's policies. So it's a weird story, and there's a lot of different ways you can take it, but I find it interesting. So here's the scoop on that. He was recently endorsed by the Farmers Federation, And by the way, I got a lot of friends over at the Farmers Federation, been a member for it for a large portion of my life. I'm not now, but I was for a very long time. I mean, I was into cattlemen's and 4-H and FFA. I was a state officer in FFA. I got a lot of friends down at the Farmers Federation. Lots of good people down there at Alpha. So it's a group that I have a lot of respect for. They have one of the most coveted endorsements in the entire political realm because they are powerful and rich, and also because Alabama is such a big ag state that if you get the Farmers Federation stamp of approval, that looks really good for you. That's a big boost to your campaign. Now, they might also give campaign donations on top of that, but that's a political endorsement that people value very highly. And frankly, I was really surprised when they wound up giving it to Tuberville. Not because I think that it would be beyond them to do so. They've endorsed people that I didn't necessarily like all that much over the years. That's happened. The Farmers Federation and I don't always see eye to eye. We're very different, for example, in our stances on farm subsidies. But nonetheless, apparently they have decided that Tommy Tuberville is their guy. And in response to this, Tuberville did an interview on one of our sister stations up there with Matt Murphy on Talk 95.5. So he went on talk radio for our Cumulus station in Birmingham, and this is a statement that he made in it. And I want you to listen to this because he's waffling in such a way that you almost don't know what side he's going to come down on. It's like when you would spin the coin to instead of flipping it to find whether it was going to land on heads or tails. This is kind of what that's like, but he almost is waffling back and forth between heads and tails and trying to have it both ways. So this is Tuberville on the radio the other day. Quote, I met a lot of great people, referring to the Farmers Federation. I was around people that really care about the state and country, and they're hurting right now, obviously about the tariffs. But you know, there's no bigger supporter of President Trump, even though he's been putting a noose around the neck a little bit in terms of choking them out and keeping that price down. And they're not making money. So I just hope we get this thing over with because they're great people. This is a weird one to have to react to because you're not really sure where Tuberville stands on this because of the nature, the way that he tried to convey it, that, well, I'm against tariffs and they're really choking out farmers and they're really hurting them and putting a noose around their neck. But I mean, come on, it's Trump. It's not like he can do things that are wrong. That kind of feels like what Tuberville is trying to say without coming out and flat saying that. That, well, tariffs are a really terrible idea, but because I really like President Trump, I'm going to pretend like they're not. He doesn't want to say that per se, but that kind of seems to be the sentiment that he's reflecting. And by the way, even though I think that that's silly, the truth is there are a lot of people in the Farmers Federation themselves that happen to be conservative, that happen to be socially conservative and fiscally conservative. And if it were anybody else pushing tariffs, they would say, nope, don't trust them. Tariffs are a terrible idea. But for whatever reason, there is a portion, not all of them, but a portion of people in this country, even ones that are being directly adversely affected by tariffs, that are saying, well, you know what? It's okay because Trump has a long game going here. I disagree with that synopsis, but the point is there are people that really do think that way, and they behave and act and vote as though that is the case. So you don't have to believe it. The point is they believe it. And Tuberville characterizing them this way is not incorrect. Because he's saying, yeah, a lot of them are really big Trump supporters, even though he's got a noose around their neck when it comes to tariffs. That's actually a scarily accurate portrayal here. Now, normally, I would look at this and give Tuberville credit for being critical of the president when he needs to be. Actually trying to call balls and strikes and not just being a Trump fanboy like he has been this entire campaign. But he's trying really hard to be critical of that and also maintain his biggest Trump fan status. So he's being critical, and everything that he said in that statement is accurate, but he's also trying to hedge his bets by saying, well, yeah, the policy sucks, but I mean, come on, it's Trump. You can't say anything bad about Trump. Doesn't matter how dumb the policy is. I'm not going to say anything bad about Trump. I mean, he doesn't come out and quite say that, but he pretty much says it. And that's the thing that is a little bit disturbing. And the thing is, factually, he could not be more correct. In fact, Alabama farmers are being hit very hard by the tariffs. And they know it, and Tuberville knows it, and the Farmers Federation knows it. It's probably one of the things that they talked about while he was there. In fact, they did a ranking. I can't remember which organization did this because it was a while back. It was when the tariff debate first came out. They did a ranking of the 50, out of the 50 states, which ones would be most affected by the tariffs, and Alabama ranked fourth. So out of all 50 states, we're the ones that are affected fourth most out of all of them. And the reason for that is fairly obvious if you know anything about Alabama's cultural and agricultural landscape. It's because we grow a lot of cotton and a lot of soybeans. Well, the Chinese people eat an awful lot of soybeans. And they also, one of their biggest industries is the textile industry, which uses cotton. Soybeans is the bigger one. Cotton is also being affected by this. And so because the trade has been interrupted and because these prices are being kept artificially high, they're being inflated by the market with these government taxes on them. Because of that, you're seeing a dip in sales, a dip in product being moved. American farmers are just not able to keep up the way that they were in the past when the tariffs did not exist. This is something that is hurting them dramatically because, as I've always said and maintained to this day, ultimately, a tariff is a tax on the American people. You're only shooting yourself in your foot when you invoke tariffs because you're artificially raising your own products. But nonetheless, that's exactly what's happening here. And so Tuberville, even though he actually does get it right, he's still trying to do this dance of criticizing Trump, but not really criticizing Trump. And it really is shameful because this was one of the first things that Tuberville has said that I was just sitting there like, yes, thank you. Finally, Tuberville actually said something of substance and he got it right. But then he tries to do the dance where he's like, but I'm really still for Trump. I'm still Trump's biggest fan. Still the biggest supporter of Trump. Look, nobody is worthy of that level of protection. As much as I revere men like Ronald Reagan, Calvin Coolidge, George Washington, they made mistakes. They're human beings. They're flawed. And when they made mistakes, or I believe that they made mistakes, I point them out. And that's true of guys that I really like. I like Ted Cruz. I like Mike Lee. When they make lapses in judgment, and all of them have at some point, I point that out. Not because I dislike them, but because I do like them and want them to improve. Now, when I point out the mistakes of the Democrats, I also want them to improve. I'm just not holding my breath on that. But the point is, it's always done with the sense of, I'm not pointing it out because I hate you. I'm pointing it out not because you're my political enemy. I'm pointing it out because I think the idea is bad. And that's really where we need to come to as a country, where we take the personalities out of it, the people and the names out of it. We can just look at ideas and say, yeah, that idea is not going to work. Or that idea, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And it doesn't matter to us who's behind the idea. Even though I don't like, and this I'm actually doing, oddly enough, we're kind of going into ideaception here. I don't really like Eleanor Roosevelt, but this is a really brilliant quote by her. She said, small minds talk about people, larger minds talk about events, and great minds talk about ideas. And she's absolutely right, but we spend so much of our political clout, and Tuberville does here, talking about people instead of ideas. He verges on the idea of talking about ideas here, and then backs off on it because he's afraid of the personality behind the idea. And that's reflective of where a lot of people are on the political scene in our society today, and it's something that really just has to stop. And yes, I understand the Trump supporters' explanation of why it's okay to do this. is, well, Trump is just doing this temporarily in order to get a long-term better deal and even move to free trade, which Trump has been all over the place on this. There's days where he wakes up in the morning and for whatever reason feels like saying, yeah, we're all for free trade and that's what we're eventually trying to get to. And there's some days where he wakes up and he says, no, tariffs are the best thing ever, and anybody that says differently is an idiot. And it really just depends on what Trump had for breakfast that morning as to which version of Trump on tariffs that you're going to get. That's unfortunately on a lot of issues, that's the way that Trump is, but especially on the tariffs thing. So basically, the way I would sort of take that apart is, I hope you're right. I really do. Because there's nobody that wants to see American farmers and American engineering and manufacturing thrive more than me. But the history and the data is just not on your side. I'm sorry. I wish it were. I wish protectionism worked. I wish that we lived in a country where just about everything that we bought was made in America. I really do. But I understand that's not reality. Not anymore. And protectionism has never worked anytime it's been tried. The most spectacular failure of it is when it made worse a depression that wound up lasting 10 years in the 1930s. We tried protectionism then. It only made things worse. It actually made things far worse and made prices much higher at a time where people didn't have a lot of money. And it's been tried every so often ever since then. The Bush era steel tariffs, they wound up saving a few jobs in the steel industry, but costing well over $20 million per job. Per job saved. Well, we would have been better off just taking money from the government and giving it to people and letting them work for it. Tariffs have never worked at any time they've ever been tried in human history, American history or history somewhere else. And so there's no reason to engage in them. But I will say this, and I do agree with this principle. China is our second biggest threat. And the only reason that they're second is because Russia is more aggressive. China has the bigger gun. China has the bigger army. They're the ones that are a stronger threat, but they're not a bigger threat because they're not nearly as aggressive as Russia. And also, we're in a position, mostly because of our trade, that, yeah, China could try to nuke us, but that'd be a really bad idea for them economically because they sell so many goods here in America. It's peace through trade. And so I would say that Russia still remains our number one threat just because of the level of aggression and their willingness to attack us. China, I think, would be far more hesitant to do so. But the reason that this is a problem, especially when you consider that China has been stealing intellectual property for a really long time. They're trying with Project Dragonfly to create a giant gulag state to where their communist government can basically run things from a central office and try to socially engineer entire populations. Yeah, that scares the mess out of me. And we should be concerned about it. We should be concerned about China. It's just we have far better weapons in our arsenal other than tariffs that don't hurt our citizens, don't hurt our farmers, and don't artificially inflate prices on food for families. There are other tools in the kit that work better. I'm not saying we don't go to work on China. I'm saying there are smarter ways to do it. I mean, everything from sanctions to drawing up better trade deals, which I think the president would actually be in favor of. All of those things work better historically than tariffs do. And the reason that that's especially true of China, because I would adopt the same policy, the same stance on this, even if we were talking about Russia or some other country. But the reason that's especially true of China is because Chinese culture is very, very different from Western culture. Typically, when we think about elections or what we're going to do policy-wise, what we're thinking about is, all right, how do we make it through the next election cycle? How do we make it through the next 4 years? It's a completely different mindset in the East. China is thinking 500 years into the future. Sometimes it works in their favor, sometimes it doesn't. But the point is, it's really hard to try to out-long game China, which is what Trump is trying to do with the tariffs. He's like, you know what, we'll just let them suffer for a little while, and then eventually we'll get a much better trade deal out of it. China doesn't think about things in the way that we do. They don't think, well, how are we going to get to the next election? How are we going to get to the next process to where, because we have to be held accountable to the voters. Yeah, they don't. The Chinese don't have that problem. And so because of that, they're thinking 100, 200, 500 years into the future. And so they're thinking, yeah, if we don't have access to American markets for another 2, 3, 4 years, that's fine. See, that's the difference, because if they attacked America and lost our business for a decade or so because we got engaged in some kind of giant world war, they really don't want to do that because that has long-term implications. But yeah, taking a loss on tariffs for a year or two before somebody cracks, trying to play chicken with Chinese tariffs with the Chinese is a really bad idea because they think very differently than we do. And they're going to be far more willing to accept those losses for a while until we have to have our stuff back. It's a really bad plan. I do think that the goal, the desired result, is noble. I just disagree with the tactic being used to achieve it. So I've got, I tell you what, we do have something else that's really important, but it's going to take us a while, and we need to go ahead and take a break anyway, so we'll do that, and we'll be back in just a moment.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will be from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. And a centurion's slave was sick and about to die. When he had heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Now Jesus was triggered upon hearing this and said, "None of the good things he has done matter, because he is a slave owner, and we must never admit that anyone that ever owned slaves is capable of doing anything good. Furthermore, instead of asking me for help, you should have passed universal health care by now so that he could receive treatment for free." Then Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, this man is engaged in systematic oppression. He is clearly engaging in wage slavery by controlling the means of production to exploit the labor of those around him." Then Jesus gathered up a mob and protested on the centurion's lawn all night long with torches and signs reading, "Down with the patriarchy," terrifying him and his family. We never really found out what happened to the centurion's slave. Wow. So inspiring. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back, all. This is another local story, but it's actually a day or two old, but I didn't have time to go over it recently because, of course, we had the big thing with Nikki Haley, and we may have a special guest coming in tomorrow. I'm still trying to work that out, so I don't want to tell you who it is yet, but be sure to tune into tomorrow's show because he's an author. He's going to be coming to Faulkner's campus tomorrow. I'm going to try to get him on at least for a few minutes, but we'll see how that goes. So a few days ago, there was an article posted, and you may recall that we were talking about an article a few days ago involving a mother who was essentially let go from her job because she got pregnant. And if you want the full discussion on that, it's available on my YouTube channel, Tactics Radio. You can look it up. It really is a fascinating story. I think that it's a good segment where we break some of these things down, but this article is largely a response to it, not a rebuttal, just a response. And so because of that, Kyle Whitmire who is a rabid leftist, is talking about this in the pages of AL.com. He's a reporter for them. And the headline pretty much says it all. I mean, I would never encourage somebody to just read a headline and leave it at that and not read the actual story. I think that one of our biggest problems with our outrage culture is that we read headlines and not stories, and then sometimes we get things wrong. This one you can pretty much, like, when I clicked on it, I saw the headline, and I clicked on it, and the article was exactly what I felt that it would be. I mean, I could have almost, as a parody, written this thing myself, and it would have turned out almost exactly the same. So the headline of this article: allegedly pro-life Alabama makes life, a word that I can't say on the air, for moms. And as you can imagine, it's every bit a piece of leftist drivel that you would imagine it to be. And so we're going to go through some of these common arguments. There's nothing new here. There's nothing brilliant here. Whitmire basically just recycles a bunch of old, tired arguments in favor of abortion and in favor of some kind of massive socialist state. This is basically just him doing that. And there's nothing profound in it, but these are common arguments, and because you may run up against some of these arguments in public or in discussing them with your friends and neighbors, I'm going to kind of do this as a service to you so you understand how to counter these. So this is a part of the article. Alabama, we're pro-life. That's what they said. And we elected them. So in effect, we said it too. But it just ain't true. This week, my colleague, Ann Claire Vollers, came again with a heavy dose of reality. In Alabama, there's a symbolic law on the books against abortion, but there's nothing in those same pages to protect mothers before or after their babies are born. All right, so here's the thing. This is a really, really common red herring fallacy that gets brought up all the time, whether you're discussing abortion in Alabama or you're discussing it anywhere else in the country. You hear leftists repeat this over and over again. Oh, well, you care about babies in the womb, but you don't care about them once they're born, and you don't care about mothers. It's a red herring fallacy. Whether or not people are taking care of mothers or not has nothing to do with whether or not you should have the right to kill a child in their womb. Now, if you want to have a separate discussion about that and whether or not we should be taking care of, and by that they usually mean a giant socialist welfare program, but we can have that discussion. But it makes no sense to tie it to abortion. These are two completely different issues, and trying to tie them together doesn't make any sense. So you've got that right off the bat. Their logic essentially boils down to, well, Alabama's really mean to mothers, and so to be nice to them, we should let them kill their children in the womb. First of all, I don't understand how that's being nice to women anyway. And even if Alabama was mean to mothers by not giving them things that you're talking about, even if that were the case, I don't understand how abortion would make recompense for that. That might be an issue. That might be an argument for being nicer to mothers, but offering them abortion is not an answer to that. If you're saying that Alabama needs to do more to protect mothers or do more to help the kids that are born, okay, well, that's a discussion that I'm open to having. Normally, the left, like I said, brings that up, and their solution is very different than mine. But the point is, I'm not opposed to having that discussion, but trying to tie the two together just doesn't make any sense. Because a great example of this, let's test drive that logic for a second. Let's take it out for a spin and see if it works when you change the groups around. Let's say, you know what? Alabama does not have a law that says you can't fire Muslims for being Muslims. Which, by the way, there actually are anti-discrimination laws, but I'm just going with a hypothetical here. You know, there's no law in Alabama that says you can't fire a Muslim because they're Muslim, so what we ought to do is we ought to kill the Jews, because Muslims hate the Jews, and if we killed the Jews, that would make the Muslims happy, so that's what we should do. Alabama's real mean to the Muslims, and so that would be the way to solve the problem. No, it wouldn't. The idea that we should be taking the rights from one group of people to appease another group of people that we haven't been nice enough to, and by that the left means give lots of free stuff at taxpayer expense, that doesn't make any sense. And yet it is the argument that we hear over and over and over again from the left. Yes, it doesn't make any sense, but they continue to repeat it as though it does. So here's another piece of that article. In Alabama, an allegedly pro-life state, this is what passes for maternity leave. You're pregnant, you're fired. As Bowlers reports, more than half of states have laws protecting moms from being fired for being moms. All right, here's the thing. We went over this piece last week. If you want more details on that, I highly recommend you check out my video on it. And I'm not saying that you just take my word for it. I would rather, and I actually say this in that piece that I did, I would rather you go find this article. You can find it on AL.com. It's titled, I don't remember the exact title, but it essentially boils down to moms being fired for being moms. Alabama says that's okay. It's something to that effect. You can check it out. I have the link to the actual original article on all of my social media platforms. You can scroll down and look at it on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm not saying just take my word for it. Read the article yourself and then watch my analysis of it and see which one you think is right. I'm fine with that. But the point is, we went over this already, and as I concluded in that video, just giving you a quick summary of it, those protections are unnecessary because the free market takes care of it. And what's hilarious is the story that they use in that article to try to make the case that there should be protections for women that get pregnant in the workplace. In that story that they try to hold up as the pinnacle of why we need these protections, the free market did its job. The woman wound up getting a better job than she had before, with a boss that was more understanding and had better benefits to help accommodate the fact that she was a new mom. And the idiot boss that was a jerk to her for no reason lost a dedicated employee. The free market did exactly what it was supposed to do in the very story that they're trying to hold up as an example of, well, this is why we need these protections, and this is why just leaving it to the free market doesn't work. Their own story, it proves why you don't need those laws in place. It just astounds me that they don't see that. But anyway, he goes on further down. Usually, a statistic like that comes with an ugly map of southern outliers that looks a heck of a lot like a Confederate atlas. But not this time. North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Texas all have laws protecting mothers in the workplace. Heck, even West Virginia has such a law, a state that's been doing its, word I can't say on the air, to displace Mississippi as 50th in everything. This has very little to do with the actual subject matter of the story, but real quick, I think it does bear mentioning. Leftist journalists in this state have a really weird habit of constantly dumping on the state and dumping on the South in general, and yet continue to live here. I've always found that weird, because they always talk about it as it's this evil, racist, satanic state of some kind, that we're still living in the Confederacy and we're still enslaving people. To read the things that they say about the South, you would think that that is going on to this day, and yet they continue to live here. It's really strange. They wouldn't even have to leave the country. They could literally just drive 6 or 7 hours and start a new life doing pretty much the same thing in a different state. If it's so horrible and it's so awful and they can't stand it and it's the worst place you could possibly live and it's filled with evil racist Christians and bigots that are so close-minded, why do you continue to live here? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, sure, Alabama in the South has problems. And there's even some things that we're tailing behind on, and I'll be the first one to admit those. But I don't understand the constant bashing and this assumption that the South is an evil, very bad place. And what's interesting to me is they know that they can say this. They know that it whips up their base, because this guy is not writing, and he knows he's not writing to an objective third party or to conservatives. He's writing specifically to a base of Democrats, liberals in the state of Alabama that similarly loathe the place that they live, yet continue to live here. It's a really weird dynamic that I've never understood. I mean, and you reverse it. If you had a conservative that was constantly complaining about how backwards and weird and how they've tried to create a giant nanny state in California or New York, my immediate response would be, well, why are you still living there? This isn't just a conservative versus liberal thing. It wouldn't make sense if it were reversed. But anyway, that's just kind of the way that it goes. Here's another piece of that article. And Alabama doesn't just lag behind in workplace protections. Let us count the ways. Fewer than half the counties in Alabama have hospitals where a woman can have a baby. This cannot be said enough. Alabama consistently ranks the worst 5 states for infant mortality. Twice in the last 5 years, we were the absolute worst. In the last 4 years, we've ranked third worst for birth weight. The same goes for preterm births. All right. Every single one of these, perfectly legitimate complaints and problems. I don't have a single problem with addressing any of the issues brought up here. And if there is a government program, even though, I tend to be very libertarian, if there is a government program that you can show me that it will work and actually have a positive effect, I'll at least consider, maybe supporting it. But again, he's using a complete red herring here. He's basically using this as saying, well, see, Alabama doesn't really care about children. Well, yeah, people on both sides of the aisle see these as legitimate issues that ought to be addressed. They may disagree on how to address them, but I don't know of anybody that hears that Alabama has one of the worst, and this is true, one of the worst infant mortality rates in the country and says, no big deal, we'll be fine. I don't know of anybody on either side of the aisle that says that. And it's also worthy of note that even though Alabama does have one of the worst infant mortality rates in the country, it is still infinitely higher than the vast majority of the world. America has a very low infant mortality rate. And even in a state like Alabama, where it's higher than the other 49 states, it's still pretty darn low. Doesn't mean that we can't address these things, doesn't mean there's not lots of room for improvement that I am willing to hear your case on. But the point is, we can't treat it as though it's this massive tragedy that we're so far behind the rest of the world. Now, it's pretty good here compared to the rest of the world. And here's another thing, too. He's very concerned about infant mortality rate, and yet he's openly advocating for abortion. Now, I want you to put your thinking caps on here. What is the infant mortality rate of successfully aborted children? Oh yeah, 100%. I've always thought it was super weird that people in Alabama start bringing up the infant mortality rate while advocating for abortion. Perfectly legitimate problem, like I said, something that we do need to work on, something that we've got to figure out a way to get that down. But why would you bring that up as though this is a great tragedy, which it is, while also advocating for a policy that kills children? You want to bring down the infant mortality rate? Stop abortions. That's going to do an awful lot to curb it. It is a testament to how depraved their mind are that they're like, you know what? Too many babies die in Alabama. Also, we need to make sure that laws are available to women to kill their children. Well, if the goal is more living babies, you can't really be pro-abortion. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And here's the last part of this article that we'll read. Alabama lawmakers aren't ignorant of these things. A majority of them just don't care. When lawmakers debated unenforceable abortion bans, Senator Linda Coleman Madison in Birmingham argued loudly and passionately for doing better for Alabama's mothers and children. Quote, "The sin to me is bringing a child in this world and not taking care of them," Coleman Madison said then. "The sin for me is that the state does not provide adequate care. We don't provide education, and when the child is born and we know that the mother is indigent, then she cannot take care of the child. We don't provide any support for that mother." You see, again, I don't have to rehash that this is a massive red herring fallacy because we've already gone over that. But this is really the crux of the leftist argument. Because if you were to distill this entire article into a very simple worldview, what it would be is, you know what, if you really loved me, you'd let me do what I want and give me lots of free stuff. That is the thinking behind this article. Basically, the left operates like a very emotional teenage girl. That the second that you say that you're not going to give them their way or you're not going to buy things for them, they say, well, if you really loved me, if you really cared about me, you'd give me lots of free stuff. If you really cared about me, you'd let me do what I want and not ask questions. Perfect example of this was the Hobby Lobby case, where they wanted their employer to be legally mandated to provide their birth control, but also not have any say over what birth control was purchased. That would be like your teenager saying, I want your credit card and I want to be able to go out and buy things. I just don't want you to have any say over what I buy. No, that's not how this works. Again, that is a different discussion, but really what it all does come down to is they want lots of free stuff and they want to be able to do whatever they want. That's not the way that this is going to work. Look, if you want to take the libertarian position on it, I disagree with it because most libertarians are pro-abortion. I think that violates the first principle of libertarianism, which is my liberty to swing my fist stops where your face starts, because there is another person involved. But nonetheless, I at least understand where they're coming from. They say, you got to take care of yourself. Live and let live. But they're trying to make that argument, and then on top of it saying, well, I want you to let me do what I want, but I also want you to pay for all of it. It's absolute and utter madness, and this is why people get frustrated with the left, is because their thinking essentially goes no deeper. It is no more mature than an angry teenage girl. And that's why they get so frustrated with this whole thing. But there is good news, because not everybody in Alabama, in fact, not even most of the people in Alabama, share Kyle Whitmire's views on this. In fact, earlier this past week, 5 Alabama protesters declared Birmingham a sanctuary city for the unborn. Now, this was all done in response to the fact that Planned Parenthood is going to try to open up a clinic in Birmingham. Right now, the only Planned Parenthood clinics are in Montgomery, Huntsville, and Mobile, and there is not one in Birmingham. And these pastors oppose them opening up said clinic in Birmingham. They were joined also by Representative Arnold Mooney. You may recall he's one of the representatives running for the Senate seat. And so he was there. Here's the thing that I do find funny about this, though. The functionality of it is essentially the same as a sanctuary city. Now, there's no legal backing from the city of Birmingham behind this, but the idea is actually kind of the same. That federal law mandates that we do not have illegal immigrants. And so we're going to say, screw that noise and protect them anyway by not enforcing their laws. Well, what would be the difference in a city or a state even doing exactly the same thing when it came to abortion? Well, yeah, the Fed says that we have to do this, but we're just going to do what we want anyway. You see, people like Whitmire and other pro-abortion activists would be absolutely livid at that suggestion. That we said, you know what? We know Roe v. Wade is there, but we really just don't care. And if the Fed wants to enforce it, they can send the army down and try to enforce it themselves. Well, they would be freaked out over that. They would say that that's immoral, that it thumbs its nose at the rule of law, and yet suggest we do exactly the same thing when it comes to illegal immigration. Say that it's perfectly okay for cities to actively subvert ICE and the Border Patrol and other law enforcement agencies that are trying to find illegal immigrants. They would say that it's perfectly okay to do that. So there is a massive, massive double standard there. We're expected to follow all the federal laws that they like, and it's okay to ignore them if it's a federal law that they don't like. And the difference here is that immigration enforcement actually is a constitutionally mandated power of the federal government. You can find it in Article 1. It's something that the power is supposed to rely with Congress to create universal rules for naturalization. That's something that's actually in Congress's purview, says nothing about abortion in the Constitution. And yet, even though you have something that the Constitution mandates that the federal government do in one instance, they say it's perfectly okay to just ignore what the Fed does in our individual cities there. But they would freak out if you tried to do the same thing like these pastors are talking about in Birmingham, making a city a sanctuary city for the unborn, even though the Constitution never mentions that. One last thing before we go to the Daily Dose of Stupid and wrap this whole thing up. We did get news, and I failed to mention this the other day, that Bernie Sanders has had some kind of cardiac event. I don't think that they're actually calling it a heart attack, but it's something similar, some kind of blockage or something. And of course, he was in the hospital. First of all, prayers going to Bernie Sanders. Can't stand the guy. I think that he's a full-on communist. He is my political enemy. That doesn't mean I hate him. Doesn't mean I want ill things to happen to. I don't want him to have any kind of terrible reaction. I don't want him to die. None of those things. And I've said the same thing even with people that their death would actually politically benefit me in some way, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or one of the other liberal justices. You are not going to hear me on this program say ghoulish things about Bernie Sanders. Not going to do it. And I think that the Christian thing to do here, because we are told to pray for our enemies, is of course to pray for Bernie to have a speedy recovery. And I do genuinely want that. Even if the Bible didn't command that, it would still be the right thing to do. And so, hopefully Bernie does get better soon. I don't want anything bad to happen to him, but let's face it, Bernie's getting on up there. And I do think that it is important, and this is part of the reason that I wanted to not talk about it immediately, because I always like to let things cool down out of respect for him, out of respect for his family, before we start talking about the political implications of it. It's the reason that I have my 48-hour rule when it comes to tragedies. I don't know that this necessarily qualifies, but it's close enough that I decided to err on the side of caution. So let's talk about that. If Bernie Sanders goes down, if he can't continue on the campaign trail, and right now he's saying that he's going to appear on the debate floor, I'll believe it when I see it. Maybe he will. But if this winds up taking Bernie out of the race, I think that the Bernie Sanders voter winds up being split. But I think the majority goes to Elizabeth Warren. You're going to see some of the Bernie bros, because they still don't trust Warren, and by the way, with good reason. You're going to see some of the Bernie bros go to Andrew Yang. You might, I doubt it, you might even see a couple of them go to Bob O'Rourke. I don't think you could have them gravitate towards Booker, because one of the things that Bernie draws from, one of the things that his voters really like about him, is that he's a very authentic and genuine person. And he is. He's genuinely and authentically wrong, but the point is, he is honest. And so because of that, and because a lot of the people that have voted for him, that's something that really draws them, I don't think that they could ever go towards a Cory Booker, because he might be the most inauthentic person that has ever lived. Now, Sanders is also very inauthentic, but she's also doing very well in the polls, and because Bernie had an alliance with her, I think the Bernie bros would feel a lot more comfortable because of Bernie's personal friendship with Warren, and because of her policy stances themselves. I think they'd be most comfortable moving over to Warren. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that I am. I think that they will very reluctantly move over to Warren if that takes place. Now, I've been saying for a long time, it is Joe Biden's to lose. That right now, because of the way that he's polling and the things that Democrat voters are saying in their public opinion polls and in their focus groups, that the most important thing for them is to beat Donald Trump, and Joe Biden stands the best chance of that, that Biden has such a massive lead that there's really nothing that he can do about it. But if all of a sudden all those voters move over to Warren, or at least a big chunk of them move over to Warren, again, you're going to have some hemorrhaging to Yang and some of the other lesser-known candidates. But if that takes place, that is the path to victory for Elizabeth Warren. She's going to have to surge, and she's going to have to surge really hard to catch up. But uniting those two camps, basically uniting that socialist vote, the people that want full-on socialism, bringing those people together, that at least provides Warren with a path to victory. Now, frankly, a lot of people, including myself, believe that that's actually better for Trump. Because, let's face it, Elizabeth Warren is shrill and very closed up and buttoned up, and she has very thin skin, can't handle being in the fray with somebody. Donald Trump is the worst possible matchup for someone like Warren. I mean, to put it into perspective, Donald Trump is the Blastoids to Elizabeth Warren's Charizard. Yeah, Charizard may be a better, stronger Pokemon in several matches, but your Blastoids is usually going to beat a Charizard because it's a water type. And I apologize for everybody over the age of 30 that had no idea what that meant, but trust me, it's a good analogy. You just have to play Pokemon to understand it. But that's really what's going on here. I think that there's a lot of Republicans that Warren would be a very tough general election opponent. I don't think that Donald Trump is one of them. The guy is like basically genetically engineered to defeat somebody like Elizabeth Warren. I mean, we already saw what he did with Hillary Clinton, and that was somebody that had much thicker skin. So with Elizabeth Warren, I mean, I could see her imploding several times on a debate stage going up against him. But anyway, I think that that's probably what's going to happen. And you couple that with the fact that Biden is now under scrutiny because of this whole Ukraine thing. The media is not talking about it. But did you know that his fundraising dropped 70% last week? 70%. Now, granted, that's an initial sticker shock kind of reaction. There are going to be some donors that see this and they're all of a sudden real angsty and real anxious about putting their money on that horse. And if time goes on and his poll numbers don't drop too dramatically, that might pick back up again. But the point is, that scare is real and it is there. And because the scare is there on Biden, and Elizabeth Warren now has the advantage of a lot of those Bernie votes coming over, I think that there is a very, very real chance, maybe even a very likely chance, that Warren becomes the Democrat nominee. So that's where we are. But one last thing that I will say about this. I notice that when Bernie did have his cardiac issue, he didn't go to Venezuela or Cuba. And I get that it's not exactly a fair statement to make, because when you have something like that, you don't exactly get to pick which hospital you're going to. It's not like cancer where you actually have a little time to look into where you want your treatments to be. But Bernie continues to get the greatest healthcare in the world. He actually said on stage in a debate with Ted Cruz, like, we have the greatest healthcare in the world. So he believes it. This isn't just making things up or putting it in his mouth. Bernie Sanders even believes that we have the greatest healthcare in the world. Now, his criticism of it is, but you have to have money to use it. Well, yeah, you get what you pay for. But nonetheless, I'm not going to get off into all of the talking points on that, but it just amazes me that somebody can have his life saved time and time again by the free market, for-profit healthcare system and still covet something else. And I say this as somebody that had my own life saved by the free market system. I just don't understand how someone can see that happen and admit that our healthcare system is superior to every other country on earth and still want to ruin it. Still want to be more like the other countries that he admits are not as good as ours. That just absolutely blows my mind, and there's only one explanation for it. It's envy. You see, for him, it would be better to be worse. It would be better to be like the other countries because that's more fair. Because he is so burned up by the idea that somebody might have more than him and because of that can afford better care than somebody else can afford, that he'd rather just everybody be equal even if that population is getting inferior care to what they were getting with the healthcare system beforehand. See, to him, fairness is more important than it actually being better, because in his mind, the worst thing that can happen is some people have more than others. Just like every other aspect of socialism, the whole thing is built on the idea of envy. They would rather have a system that is worse for everyone than for one person to have better than somebody else. It absolutely doesn't make sense, but that's how they operate. Let's go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
And for today's Daily Dose of Stupid, actually a local story for this one. Grandma Kay has stepped in it. And by the way, just to preface this, I don't wish any harm to Kay Ivey, our governor. I don't want anything bad to happen to her. And as a fellow cancer patient, I am praying for our governor. I hope that she comes out of this better and stronger than ever. I really do. But I have a job to do. And my job is to point out when politicians, people in power, people in office, make dumb decisions. And this is one of them. I can't hold my punches just because Kay Ivey happens to have cancer right now, which, by the way, if somebody had been critical of something that I said on my show while I had cancer, I would have been fine with that. In fact, that happened a few times, and I was fine with it. People are free to disagree with me, and I don't want them to play softball with me because I happen to be sick, and I think that, I don't know if Kay Ivey would feel the same way, but that's how I would operate, and because of that, that's how I'm going to treat other people. So, Kay Ivey's office appointed Rosie Lyles to a board of registrars. The problem with that, the board of registrars, of course, controls several aspects of voting in the state of Alabama. The only issue with hiring her specifically is that she was convicted of voter fraud about a decade ago. And it included 4 felony counts of absentee voter fraud and 1 felony count of possession of a forged instrument. So in other words, something that allowed her to forge documents and pretend as though votes were something that they weren't. And by the way, what happened with that is she wound up pleading guilty to misdemeanor possession of a forged instrument in 2009. Well, that is a substantial downgrade from 5 felonies to 1 misdemeanor. And I could be wrong. I smell some home cooking going on here. Now, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's just an overactive imagination on my part. I don't have anything to back this up, and I understand that. I'm not trying to say that I know something that I don't. But you have somebody, and I don't imagine there would have been a plea deal involved, because who are you going to rat out? Like, it's one thing if somebody does something really bad and the DA decides to let them off, or let them off with a lighter sentence because they give up names and that kind of thing. Granted, maybe it's a weird case where there was widespread voter fraud, but I don't see that. And so that is a substantial downgrade from 5 felony counts to 1 count of misdemeanor. So I'm guessing this person, whomever she is, even though I've never heard of her before, must be somebody with friends in high places that is very well connected. That's just my suspicion. I don't know that, but it seems that way. And I'm guessing that she must be a buddy of Kay Ivey's or somebody close to her, and that's how she wound up getting this position, and probably also how she wound up getting out of 5 felony counts. They did notify Secretary of State John Merrill, and according to the person that did the hiring, there was no background check done. Really? You don't background check the people that are in charge of making sure there's no voter fraud? You don't background check them? You have to have a background check if you're working at McDonald's. Like, any job that you do, just about it includes a background check. And somehow this person who's responsible for making sure that the one person gets 1 vote, that person, you're like, they're probably good. No reason to run a background check on them. I'm telling you, this thing stinks to high heaven. There's some cronyism going on here somewhere. It may not be in the governor's office itself, but it ain't far from it either. Either the governor herself or somebody around the governor is engaging in cronyism, because that's the only way to explain, at least the only way that I can think of, to explain all these weird happenstances, like no background check and all the charges getting downgraded and her getting this despite having this history. I don't buy into the fact that this is all a coincidence. And when Secretary Merrill was notified, he said that technically she is qualified because her conviction was a misdemeanor. So we don't even know for sure whether or not she's going to be removed from this position or not, because Secretary Merrill says, well, I could remove her for cause, but the thing is, there's not a cause here, because the only thing that she was actually found guilty of was a misdemeanor charge. So I can't remove her for having a felony. It does bother me to think that somebody that has done this and has already broken the public trust in this way is once again in charge. Granted, it's an ongoing investigation. Maybe we'll find out something about this later. But I have to be honest, especially when it's coming to the way that people vote, if I'm the governor, I go ahead and remove this person immediately just to remove any doubt in people's minds. So here's the question. Is this cronyism, or is the governor slipping? Because that's really the only options you have left. Either the governor is corrupt, or the governor is not really all there anymore. There's incompetence going on. It's one of the two. I don't know which one. And when I figure it out, I hope that I'll be able to bring it to you. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's chaplain report comes to us from the Book of Wisdom. We are going to be going to Proverbs, and to really understand what's going on here, I will set the stage just a little bit. Solomon is passing this wisdom on to his son, and the way that he starts describing it here in chapter 4 is that these are some things that my father taught me. So we'll go ahead and look at the passage in Proverbs chapter 4, verses 5 through 9. Solomon speaking here. Acquire wisdom. Acquire understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will guard you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom, and with all your acquiring, get understanding. Prize her, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a garland of grace. She will present you with a crown of beauty. So we see some interesting symbolism in this verse. Solomon passing down some wisdom from his father, King David, to his son, whomever the son may be, because Solomon had a lot of kids. We're not sure exactly who. But either way, he's passing down this wisdom to the next generation. And he talks about wisdom. There's some interesting symbolism in that he talks about wisdom as though it's a person, specifically a woman. You'll notice that he is specific to use the female pronoun there. Now, I find that interesting on a number of levels. And if you're looking through both the biblical narrative and sheer observation, you could see why wisdom would be given the female moniker. First of all, guys, we tend to be a little immature. We tend to do some dumb things sometimes. And so maybe that's part of the reason that wisdom is being portrayed as a woman. And here's another thing that I think that it may be part of it. Both through direct command and example, women are the ones that are in charge of training up children. Of course, fathers have a big role to play too. But for example, in church education, it is women specifically that are given the charge to teach scriptures to the young children. And so what I find fascinating about that is he talks about wisdom as though she is a tutor, an instructor. And I think that that is intended to instill in whoever is hearing it a sense of humility, to get them to think about themselves, as I do when I read this, as a young child sitting at his mother's feet, trying to absorb wisdom, absorb information, and to be like her. So I don't think that this symbolism is arbitrary. I think that it's actually very important. It may be one of the biggest takeaways from this. And I think that there's another application here as well. You could think of it as the relationship of a mother and a child, and I think that it's an apt application. But look at the language used a little bit later in this verse, or in this passage. He talks about the woman as being someone that embraces you. Again, this could be a mother, but it could also be a lover. Seek after her. Look at how the verse starts. Acquire wisdom, acquire understanding, and do not forsake her. This is language that sounds similar to the relationship between a husband and his wife. Now, I'm sure that the ladies would like to take this interpretation and mean, see, you need a wife to keep you from doing dumb things. Well, that may be true. That may not be a totally incorrect application here. But I think that one of the things that Solomon is going to convey, and keep in mind, this is a guy who had 700 wives, so he understood wanting to be with women, if anybody ever did, desiring a woman. I think that what he's trying to say here is, when it comes to God's word, when it comes to wisdom, when it comes to our own knowledge and understanding, it's something that we should want in the way that we desire a beautiful woman. Wholly, completely. Because when there's a girl that you like, especially when you're in a new relationship with that person, and this should last, if it's somebody that you wind up marrying, it should last an entire lifetime. You're constantly thinking about them. You're constantly desiring to be with them. You're wanting to be in their presence. And you're wanting to also show that face to the world. That when people know you, they know you as a pair. They know you and your wife. You're a set. You go together. You belong together. That's the same way that a man of God should have a relationship with wisdom. That we should constantly be seeking after wisdom. That we should desire wisdom like we desire a beautiful woman. Constantly thinking about wisdom, trying to improve our relationship with wisdom. That's an important one. And also so that other people around us, they know that we have a reputation for being a wise person. They know that we have that relationship with wisdom, that relationship with God's word. Hey, you want to know something? Ask that guy. You want to know something? You want a wise saying? Go ask him. You want to know what God's word says about something? We should talk to this person. He'll probably know. That's the kind of relationship with God's word that he wants us to have. He wants others to be aware of it, whether they're believers or not. To understand that this is a person that meditates on the laws of God daily and doesn't just seek to know them, but to understand them. He has a thirst for them and spends time with them just like you would a wife. That's where I think this symbolism really comes into its own. And it helps us to understand the kind of relationship a person that wants to follow Jesus Christ and follow in the teachings of God and to be Christ-like. That's the kind of relationship, that's the kind of desire we should have to acquire wisdom. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.